this is so basically tonight I'm going to talk about Sir John and Hazel Lavery and the Irish collection, and really looking at them in the context of the collection that they gave to the Ulster Museum. So there's very much going to be a focus on Ulster and the birth of Northern Ireland, and how John Lavery anticipated this really in his creation of what I've called for many years his Irish collection. I have to say at the outset that the expert on Sir John Lavery is a man by the name of Kenneth McConkey, and he's written 2 books on John Lavery. I've written myself on his wife, Hazel Lady Lavery. It was the topic of my university, my master's thesis. I did it on the Laverys and their role in the emergence of the Irish Free State, leading to the placing of Lady Lavery onto the currency, because my background was that I did history of art and history as my degree. So in my master's, which was in modern Irish history, that was the topic that I chose. It's been very topical, and coming to the topic again, believe it or not, a long time later, 3 decades later, at this moment of centenary, it's really important to look at the Laverys in the context of how they were seen, both not only in London, where they lived, but elsewhere, and their contribution, I suppose, is being reassessed now in a particular way, even that they're included in this particular lecture series. This is a photograph that was taken by Emil Hoppe, who was a neighbour of theirs. He was a German photographer who photographed the celebrities of the day. He's photographing them in 1921, which is the 100th anniversary of the centenary year. It was a photograph that they used on a catalogue for an exhibition that they had in the Alpine Club Gallery, which I'll be talking about during my talk very briefly. And it was the one and the way that they looked when they hosted the treaty delegates that were negotiating the Articles of Agreement for a treaty with Great Britain and Ireland just at this very moment 100 years ago. So you can see that Lady Lavery is very glamorous there. She was claiming to be 7 years younger than she actually was. There was a 25-year age gap between the two, but you don't really see it here in this particular photograph. And at this stage, John Lavery really was the celebrity portrait painter of the day. He was incredibly well known. And I'm going to just sort of trace his history as best I can in the short time that we have. And I encourage you, as was stated earlier, to ask me as many questions, because if I gloss over anything, and sometimes when I'm talking like this, you sometimes miss the obvious things. You sort of leave out the details. So don't feel that any question is too minor or too obvious or anything. Don't feel uncomfortable asking me anything, because it may be just that I assume a degree of knowledge that isn't there. So yeah, the story here really is about a young boy. So he was born in Belfast in 1856. And within 4 years, he was orphaned. His father had been killed in a drowning. He had been shipwrecked in a ship called the Pomona, which was a very, very big tragedy. It was emigrants to Canada who were shipwrecked off the coast of Wexford. All of the passengers were lost, with the exception of some members of the crew. And so when he died, the story is that John Lavery's mother died of a broken heart. This all happened pre-official registration, so there isn't a death certificate to say what was her cause of death. But she left 3 small children, John, Henry, and Jane. And so their story was one that was so typical of what happened to orphaned children at this time. Now, they weren't put into care, they were sent to relatives. And John was sent to his father's sister, who was married and living in Soldierstown, also Moira, known as Moira in County Antrim. John Lavery says himself that the house was called Train View, but looking at this Google map here, it's hard to see where the train line is and where the view was from the house, but it certainly is this house. And probably some of you know this restaurant where they have memorabilia related to John Lavery, and they're very aware of their connection to the great painter. I wanted to include this slide in this lecture because I think it's important to look at the celebratory aspect of the fact that this artist was proud of the fact that he was from Northern Ireland, from Belfast. And what's really striking about him is, as he moves through the world, a lot of people claimed him. So he was known as one of the Glasgow boys who went to France and was working in the outdoor style, or en plein air. So in this impressionist style, he was, he was celebrated because that was where he had done his early training. But the reason that he was associated with Scotland was because he was sent there to Saltcoats when he was in his early teens. And he was sent over to work in a pawnbroker's shop, another relative of his father's family. And amidst the story that he tells himself, so he starts with a sort of version of his life story when he becomes a successful painter. And he had a very substantive book written, over 200 pages, in 1911 by a well-known art writer called Walter Shaw Sparrow, who wrote books on artists of note and architecture of the period in time. So he has a complete book on John Lavery in that year, and he puts Lavery in the context of the Celtic art, and he talks about Lavery's work in the context of his work being like Irish immigrants going out in the world. And he also describes at that stage how Lavery has to make it in the world, in the sense that it, changing fashions, changing sort of thinking of the time. And that's the one thing that we know with Lavery, is he's adaptable, he's flexible, he's always commercial, and in that way he is always looking to the future. And so that's why I think this lecture series is so fitting for the Laverys, is because he was very clear about who he was on the world stage. This idea that maybe because he had been orphaned, maybe because he had been moved between relatives and described as the wee orphan boy, and that he says himself how he played up to that, how he had known poverty. His uncles and aunt had tried to set him up. They'd given him money. At one stage, he writes in his autobiography how they gave him money and he squandered it. He was supposed to be an apprentice, go on to a job, but instead he went out in the town. He had periods where he had absolutely no money, but he was determined. He'd shown ability as an artist, so he became apprenticed to a photographer, and he began to retouch paintings. And the story that goes again in his autobiography, how they used to come, men used to come on a Monday morning to get their face painted to cover over their black eyes before they would go into work. And so he used to paint to order. He started with a small studio, but he couldn't afford to go to art school in London, and certainly not to Paris, where it was the main place for at the time. So he had a bit of good luck, in the sense that his studio burnt down, and then with that money he went first to London, and then on to the artist colonies in Brittany, and also elsewhere, where we'll see here in Fontainebleau and to Grey. So this is the point painting of Under the Cherry Tree, is from this stage where he ends up in France working out of doors in the 1880s. And it just gives you a sense of it. And just look at the opposite side there. I'm going to look at that painting afterwards from 1910 in Tangier, just to get a sense of the size and scale of his work. So this is a very poor reproduction, I'm afraid, sorry, it's slightly blurry, of the cherry tree that was taken from the Ulster Museum site. And you can see here that he's doing the study. When they looked at these type of works, they were looking at sort of people in, doing all ordinary everyday activities. And he really almost nailed it in the way that he was able to depict this. You might know of another one, it's two women sewing under a tree. But the one in which he sort of gained fame with is the tennis party. And he won a gold medal at the Paris Salon for this. And this was a new form of sport. So he's actually doing, not only is he doing an outdoor activity, he's doing a sport that's new. not only is he doing a sport that's new, he's also looking at women playing in a sort of mixed doubles. Again, that was really, really up to the minute and sort of avant-garde. And then he's also has it in such a way that it's a sort of a pleasant scene. Now, what he used to do was he'd do smaller versions and then he would build them up. So he'd work out his composition and then he would work it up to a larger picture. He didn't really do sketchbooks or, you know, any of that sort of preparatory. He was already working in oil. And so this is a painting that really set him on the stage. And even now you'll see it reproduced. It still sort of has a popularity that so you know, in terms of how he's appealing to the mass market here. He's working in a style that was celebrated, and the Glasgow boys, they're outside the salon, but he does goes one stage further, and this is very important to understand John Lavery and understand the Ulster Museum's wonderful collection, and that is that he actually, because they're outside of the salon, because they're not being accepted by the established artists, groups of younger artists come together and they set up an organization called the Society of Painters, Engravers and Sculptors. And what's really important here is that people like Rodin and John Singer Sargent, you know, are members of this organization. It's truly international. And who's the operating secretary? None other than John Lavery. So he's the guy organizing the meetings. He's the people, now he's going to move to London, and he is in London in these early years, that he begins to sort of be the coordinator. He teaches himself several languages because he had found out when he accepted a commission in Glasgow to paint the royal visit of Queen Victoria, that if he continued his style, which was to do individual portrait studies, that this was a way of working with sitters. And sitters told other sitters, and they asked him for other commissions. And for 5 winters, he lived in Germany, and he literally painted all of the minor royals that were there. In its sense, he got in touch with the people like Queen Victoria's granddaughter, who was Alec of Hesse. And Alec of Hesse, of course, went on to become the Tsarina of Russia. Her father actually asked Lavery to paint a formal portrait of her before she went to Russia, but he was really busy at that time painting all of these people. So he had actually built up a huge commercial following. So in 1898, he said himself that in a fit of Irish recklessness, he bought a lease on a house in South Kensington in London. And this is actually a contemporary photograph of the street in South Kensington, and his was the small number 5 at the end of the street. It is now, as of last year, open as the whole entire block is a contemporary art gallery. Wouldn't he just love that? The idea that you can go in and the artwork is being sold to all the different units in the front of the houses. Then there's art space and offices on the upper which can be hired out, and then there's a members area in one of the houses so that you can attend that. So it's but again, part of the reason that this particular area appealed, it's right across the road from the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's basically in a fantastic accessible part of London, which is really at the heart of that museum quarter. And basically, this is what appealed to John Lavery. You can see the blue plaque there on the wall, showing where the house is in Farmo Place. But that plaque was put up in the 1960s, so it's always been well known as the House of John Lavery. And so that was one of the reasons that the Artists Collective is now in that space, just following on from him. So we see here him. I've just jumped on ahead now, and by 1909, the year that the reason I have selected it, for those of you who are familiar with the Lavery story, you'll know that I selected the year as 1909 because that's the year that he married his second wife. So basically, I say his second wife, but we have no record, and there is no evidence to suggest that he married his first wife, who was a flower seller, who potentially or possibly was the person that Shaw based his story Pygmalion on. Although we don't know whether he was friendly with the Laverys when he was putting that story together. But he saw a flower girl, and he asked for her to pose for him as a model. He'd returned from France. That was very common. And they started a relationship. She was very, very ill throughout all of the time together because she had TB. She was actually a runaway. Her name was Annie Evans, but she told him she was called Kathleen McDermott because she thought that it would appeal to him that she was Irish. She had a daughter with him, Eileen Marion, and John Lavery, probably because of his own upbringing, brought her up in Dublin with the help of another artist, William Patrick White. But I'm not going to go into the details. Sorry, I'm getting myself a little bit down the story of the Laverys, which could go on for about 6 hours if I continued. So this is him photographed in 1909 when he marries his first wife and second relationship with Hazel Martin Trudeau. So he had met Hazel Martin when in an artist colony in Baymay in France in 1903. She'd been traveling with her mother, who was described as the old Chicago dame, even though she was the same age as Lavery. She was touring Europe with her two daughters, Hazel and Dorothy. And they were basically, Hazel was an aspiring artist, and she was working at that time, but her mother didn't approve of this Irish artist as a suitable match for her daughter. So she summoned the suitor that she had for Hazel, which was Edward Martin Trudeau, who was a doctor. She was widowed early in the marriage, actually, in fact, before she had her daughter Alice. And she married John Lavery in 1909. Her mother died in London on another trip. They spent a lot of time in Europe in 1909, and within a month she had married John Lavery. So basically, this is John Lavery at the time, and you can see how good likeness that he has of himself here. I believe that this portrait that was done in 1909 was the one that he selected and sent to the Uffizi Gallery in Italy when they requested a portrait of him. He had already had his own retrospective in the Biennale in Venice, and that was really exceptional. He had shown 53 of his works, so he was really, he was at the top of his profession by this stage when he met Hazel Lavery. It wasn't a money match at that stage. They had all of the money from his art because she came into the marriage, as it happened, through a very restrictive trust fund her mother had set up. So that she didn't actually have any money when her mother died because of the way that was, and literally never realized any of the Martin money because of the crash in 1929. So he depicted himself here very modestly. And when friends went to the Uffizi and saw this portrait of him, they said that he was too much like a house painter and he was too ordinary looking. So he requested the painting back. That's what he says. And then this painting was in his studio. It was willed to his stepdaughter Alice, and she in turn gave it to the Roth Gallery in Kilkenny, and that's why it exists there. So when Hazel met him, he had the lease on the house in Cromwell Place in London, and he also had a house in Morocco. He had started to travel to Tangier because he had loved painting in the light. He spent the winters there, and that's where some of his finest works are produced. He absolutely has an amazing ability to be able to introduce light into his canvas, and he became exceptionally well known in later years for doing interiors. I know I'm moving beyond the political, so I'm going to move along. This is the British Legation, 1910. It's also known as the Greyhound. It's part of the Ulster Museum's collection, and it's Eileen rather than Hazel, that his daughter, that you can see here. She married the following year. And but the year of 1910, the year after he married Hazel, she went with them to Morocco. And this is a sort of a typical sort of the circle in which they moved. So when he married Hazel, you can see here, this is her in 1903, the year that they met. And then you have Ma Femme, which was painted in 1910. It was shown in Paris. It was shown in Paris as Ma Femme. It was purchased by Hugh Lane, and it was exhibited as Mrs. Lavery sketching. Sketching is probably a bad representation of what, this is when she was actually producing canvases in oil. Later on, she did a lot of pencil work, but this is one of her working on an oil painting. One or two paintings in oils have survived. So he was also so well known that he was commissioned by Spottiswoode, who owned the Tatler and the Sketch, the major society magazines at the time, to produce a painting for the nation. And this is a painting that was given to the National Portrait Gallery in London as part of their permanent collection. It's interesting when you look at the paintings in the collection that when John Wainscoat was asked in 2000 to paint the royal family, he painted them in the same composition as this painting by Lavery in the White Drawing Room. So it's the Queen Mother surrounded by the Queen, Prince Charles, and Prince William and Prince Harry. And it's very much the same setting. It reflects Lavery. Lavery was very well thought of by the King and Queen. You can see here, these are the sketches of the royal family. He did several versions. And later on, I'm going to point out to you where you can see one of them on displays. He didn't really cash in on this because he saved ones and he sold them later in relation to it. But he presented the Queen with a number of the sketches for the royal collection, including this one of Princess Mary, the Princess Royal. And he also was asked through one of the ladies in waiting to contribute to the Queen Mary's dollhouse in 1921. So he painted the royal portraits in the dollhouse in Windsor, which was again it showed the interest of the King and Queen in him. And they visited the studio in 1913, and it was said in the papers at the time, of course, covered by the Society Press, that they were very comfortable with John Lavery's wife because she was an American, and that Americans had a very natural way of socializing. And John himself was working from 1910 right through to 1913 with the composition of his family, which he was calling the studio, which is in the National Gallery in Ireland. It's a very large canvas. It was originally sold into a private collection and purchased from a private collection for the National Gallery. And you can see here, you can see Lady Lavery dressed in the sort of the finery, almost like she's like an artist model at this stage. And this is her daughter Alice, sort of the age at which she arrived. And Eileen is sort of almost in secondary position behind. And then Rodney Stone is there included. And Ada, who is their Moorish maid, who they had taken out of Morocco. In early versions of this painting, you can see that John has made a composition and she's carrying tea and she's wearing sort of an ordinary outfit, and then he becomes more exotic. He also uses himself in the mirror and sort of likening it to sort of Las Meninas by Velázquez. And then behind, you can see that he has included the portrait of Queen Mary, which he was working on when he was working on the final version of this painting. His wife became very well known in society circles. This is actually a copy of this particular photograph from the Library of Congress, where she was included as Flora from the Botticelli's painting Spring. And what's interesting about this particular painting is, or the fact that Hazel decided to pose in this way, is she became really well known as a photographer's model, as an artist model. She became involved in early paradramatics. She was involved in early film. So she again, I'm over laboring the fact that they were sort of celebrities in London and moving in every circle possible, but she created a sensation by this. And these fancy dress parties that were pre the First World War, after the First World War, became the tableaux vivants that were fundraisers for the war effort. And then she was involved then in the Peace Ball in 1918, and she represented America as Illinois. After that period, she plays less in her American part. During the war, she would have been entertaining American generals and worked with Emerald Cunard, who was married to the grandson of the Cunard shipping family. So she would have been at the sort of the highest level of society, hosting. And then she sort of scandalized a lot of the sort of women in society because she posed several times as the Madonna. This is also the Great Love, the film from 1918, where she poses. And in this particular press cutting, they misidentify her, but it's very clearly her, and she did appear in that particular film. So back to Belfast again, and John decided in 1917 that he wanted to give a painting to the Catholic Church in where he was baptized. I think it's partly because of the fact that that's a place where he knew he was with his parents when he was born, and I think it meant a huge amount to him. He commissioned Lutyens to paint a very ornate Celtic frame, which I'll just show you a very bad photograph after this, just to show you it in situ. But Alice was the boy Patrick, so a lot of the critics complained that the boy Patrick looked like a girl, which of course she was, and Eileen was a particularly lovely Bridget. And behind them is the Killarney Lake, something that he used again in another painting. Their first visit as a couple was to Killarney in 1914, where they stayed in Killarney House. So this is just to give you a sense of the frame and the setting. I cropped off the photograph because I didn't want the people included in it in terms of GDPR now and that. So this is just an old picture of Donegal Place and the interior of the showing the frame by Lutyens, but also the setting of the painting within the Catholic Church. So one of the close friends that the Laverys had at this time was they were neighbours also, Clemmy and Winston Churchill. I think that you can't overlabour the fact that John Lavery was sort of someone who was able to move in not only artistic circles but also political circles, fashionable circles, and so he became a really close friend of Churchill's. And this is evidenced by the number of times that John Lavery painted Winston, even within that period of 1915. There are 4 separate canvases. The one of Churchill in uniform, and this is the period in the aftermath of the disastrous Dardanelles campaign, where he actually is out of office. That it was Hazel that encouraged him to paint, and John Lavery became his painting partner, as it were. So there are portraits in Chartwell where John Lavery is actually Winston Churchill's painting Lavery painting, and then there's Lavery painting Churchill painting, and then this one that was a commission from the one of the regiments that they commissioned this, and it actually sits in his home place with the helmet that he's wearing in the painting underneath it, so it's part exhibit as well. And I think that's wonderful. And then the painting that is a really good study of him, that's now forms part of the collection that John gave for the treaty delegation. But when he didn't paint the British delegation at the same time as he painted the Irish delegation, so he went back into his collection or added those paintings later, and that's how the Hugh Lane have a portrait of Winston Churchill that dates to 1915. So you're probably familiar with the story that he says in his autobiography that it was Hazel who encouraged him to make friends with both sides, because he could get on with anybody, and he sort of dipped his toe into politics by taking the men of the moment in 1916, and that was Sir Edward Carson and John Redmond. And of course the story was, at the time, Carson quipped that he knew that he would always hang in Dublin, and that again the likeness between the two men. These were painted by John for the Red Cross Irish Depot, so they were painted as a fundraiser. He insisted that they would both be they were canvases that were worth €500 each, and then they must be presented to the municipal gallery, which was the Hugh Lane Gallery now, but that was Hugh Lane's collection, because he had died on the Lusitania and he had wanted a modern art gallery in Dublin, and the Laverys were among the group of people who lobbied for that continually for the next number of years. In fact, Mrs. Duncan, who was the curator of the period in time, was somebody that John Lavery wrote to, telling her of his visits to Ireland, and those letters survive within the Hugh Lane collection, and that's how they know of them. So these are the 2 paintings that he did when he started to be political. Now you often see that he was politicized, and indeed in my own work, by virtue of the fact that he painted the appeal against against treason for Roger Casement, who had been Sir Roger Casement, who had been a member of the diplomatic corps, who was of course from Northern Ireland, who had joined the British diplomatic service, who had been knighted for his work in the Congo, highlighting abuses of natives in the rubber trade. So he was very well established in society. And then when he was bringing in arms from Germany, and he was captured on the odd off the coast of Kerry in the run up to the 1916 Rising. Of course, at this stage, the British Empire was at war, and it was war with Germany. So, and he had committed treason. And in the period where people tried to lobby to get his sentence commuted, John Lavery accepted this commission, highly controversial, from Justice Darling. Now, this was a commission from the bench. It wasn't a commission with sympathy for Roger Casement or the 1916 Rising. And what's really important to remember about this moment is that later Lord Birkenhead, who was a member of the delegation, well, at this stage he was F.E. Smith, really objected to the fact that he was doing this. And a lot of people thought it was in terribly bad taste that he had actually previously painted the black cap, which was the moment at which whether the cap is put on the head of the judge, again, Darling, when he passes the sentence of death. And that painting is now in the law courts in England. It's part of their collection. And John was proud of that painting, that moment that's sort of the first time it was believed to have been on canvas, because he included a plate in his autobiography which he published in 1940. But this is actually the preparatory sketch. Now, it's really hard when you're looking at paintings in this way. You don't ever get any scale or size. So something that's a massive canvas looks exactly the same as a small canvas. But this is the one that he did in situ. And in the gallery, you can see a lady with a white hat, and she's sitting beside an older gentleman. Now, the story is that Lady Lavery would attend the Casement trial with Lord Beresford, who had been Charles Beresford, who'd been very senior in the British Army. So she was again coming to it as part of the establishment. And when it comes to the final painting, John Lavery removes the gallery. It was suggested in one of the letters that he was actually going to include Eva Gore Booth in the gallery, and that he was looking to have a sitting with her so he could complete his painting, but she didn't sit for him. And this is a very interesting thing that I'm more than happy to answer questions on if anyone wants to raise it in the Q&A. But he also took the sketches of the people here in the foreground, including Casement's lawyer, who was George Gavin Duffy, who later was part of the delegation. So you have two members of the delegation here in his Casement painting. And this is the final painting, which he never really completed. He was still in a studio. He was still working on it in the 1930s. And Birkenhead wanted him to finish it and present it to the law courts, which he did as part of his will and bequest. They didn't want it so in the same way as as he had anticipated, and perhaps it had been presented earlier, maybe it would have been viewed differently. But that stage, it was highly controversial, and it's on long-term loan to King's Inns in Dublin. But you can see in the final version of the painting that, as I said to you before, the gallery is slightly changed, and then this particular man, the stenographer here, is believed to be Lavery himself. It sort of certainly looks like him, but of course his vantage point would have been over here, facing on the opposite side to Casement. So in 1920, John Lavery, according to Lord Winborne, who was the King's representative in Ireland and head of Dublin Castle at the time, he told Lady Audrey Morris, who was writing a biography of Lady Lavery in the 1950s, which was never published and I was given access to, that the Laverys were touring Ireland, and this very strange list of a crisscross of the country, including where I am speaking to you from tonight in Ballina in County Mayo, which doesn't seem to make sense. Where they're making this move, they're going to Bundoora, and they're in Ballina, they're in, you know what I mean? They're across the country. We do know that they were in Armagh, and that's listed in it, but we know why they were in Armagh. We don't know why they were in Ballina. We don't know why they were in Bundoora. And the story was that they were looking for the elusive Michael Collins, but there was something in that story. They were corresponding with Churchill, who was Minister for War at the time. He told them to be careful. John Lavery writes back to him in his autobiography, quoting the letter. That's the only place that we know of its existence, telling him that he thinks that they're going to have a continual war if he doesn't give some sort of home rule to Ireland. So it's a very strange letter coming from John at the time. In some ways, it sounds as if he's shifted allegiance at this stage. He's there to paint Cardinal Logue, Michael Logue, which is a very good a version of him. They're entertained in with the Catholic community when they come to Armagh, having come from Mount Stewart, where they'd stayed with Lord Londonderry. So again, this balancing of sort of both sides. John Lavery gets threatening letters about his involvement with Ireland at this particular point. So here is a portrait a portrait photograph again of by Hoppe of Hazel in 1921, and there are two letters here where she writes to Desmond Fitzgerald. As you can see, her handwriting isn't the easiest to read. It's the Publicity Department, Irish Delegation of Plenipotentiaries in London. Now, the thing with it is that what's really interesting for me is that new material that's been released, including these letters, sort of show that Hazel is writing to them in a sort of semi-official capacity, while John is writing to what was the centre of organisation, which was the Self-Determination League set up by Art O'Brien in London. That was really the sort of the nerve centre or the headquarters. Now, Desmond Fitzgerald did come over as part of the delegation, but she mentions in this letter that she has visited the the government buildings in Dublin when she was over in 1920. So this is suggestive that she was attending in Sinn Féin headquarters in Harcourt Street at that particular time. And so what we have here is that by the time of 1921, when the second delegation come over, there's a first delegation with Eamon de Valera in July. They don't actually come to any conclusion. Then they were supposed to have talks in Inverness, but they didn't happen. So then then they have talks in London, and the Laverys are hosting an exhibition at the time. Winston Churchill introduces the exhibition, and you can see here from the Society papers, it's sort of like anyone is at their exhibition opening, and you can see here, you can say Mrs. Cyril Asquith here. And what's really important to note at this moment is, again, that none of John Lavery's activity is affecting his clientele or the people that are mixing with them. They don't actually get affected in their celebrity in any way by his involvement with the Irish independence movement. But as they were billed in the British press as terrorists, it's really unusual that he was still being accepted everywhere. And again, I suppose that's a question that's sort of open-ended, in relation to who he was and who she was and how they managed to sort of stay friends with all sides. And so this is an image from 1919, and it shows the studio, which was the whole top part of the house. If you remember back to the picture I showed you of Cromwell Place, the small house at the end, you'll have seen there were 3 windows, and the whole of that house wasn't a large house, but the whole of the house was the studio, which had a glass roof. You can see here that this is John Lavery sitting beside the fire, and the space that's in the studio. I was there very, very recently. And what's interesting to me about the studio is that, you know, it's quite an intimate space while it's large. And Lady Lavery never had more than 8 people sitting at the table. So any of those dinners that she had for delegates or members, or trying to do this negotiation between both sides, was very much a very small and intimate affair, and very close and very thought through. So John Lavery had issued the invitations. He had painted the delegates that had come over, well, almost all the delegates that had come over in July. He had finished the portraits of Eamon de Valera, although he wasn't happy with it and wanted to do another portrait, and Arthur Griffith, which he was happy with. And then he wanted to have the other delegates have their portraits painted. John had requested Collins, but came over in October, as we know, but Collins didn't sit for him until the middle of November, quite well into those treaty negotiations. You can see that there are 2 versions here. The one that you see that's in the National, sorry, not in the National Gallery, sorry, in the Hugh Lane Gallery, that dates to 1935. That was the year that he presented his Irish collection to the Hugh Lane in Hazel's memory. She died that year. But he was painting another version of Michael Collins because he had given the portrait of Michael Collins to Kitty Kiernan. He was commercial, as I said earlier, and his commercial interest was that he basically got a print made of the painting. He got Michael Collins and himself both signed it, so you could buy signed prints. Then when Collins and Arthur Griffith died, he did the same for Griffith. When Griffith and Collins died in August of 1922, he sold another version of those prints, obviously without the signatures. So he had this sort of, he never sort of lost sight of how to commercialize what he was doing. And this is a painting of Robert Barton, and I've always sort of thought that he didn't look too happy. And this is confirmed with family stories that he wasn't happy. He felt that John Lavery and Hazel Lavery were collecting information, and he had been in the British Army. His family had land in Anamo in County Wicklow. He was a cousin of Erskine Childers, who was a secretary to the delegation, and John asked him to sit. He was quite well known because he was the author of the novel The Riddle and the Sands. So John would have loved to have had him sit, but he refused. And so you're probably familiar with this painting as I move into the Ulster collection, which is later. I'm doing this chronologically. The portrait of the Love of Ireland of Collins, but probably something like The Blessing of the Colours is probably something that would be of more interest in terms of the iconography of the new state. But I really wanted to move on in the talk and not really to dwell on those sort of the Terence MacSweeney paintings or all these other ones that you might know and expect. This painting is obviously the finished painting that is the House of Lords passing the terms of the treaty for the establishment of the Irish Free State, and it's Lord Morley addressing the House of Lords. So John was very keen to have these sort of statement pictures done. Again, this is following on from the work that he had done all those years before when he had to the state visit of Queen Victoria to the exhibition in Glasgow. So he knew the importance of these paintings, not maybe for their visual appeal, but certainly for their importance within state collections, state ownership, and the people that he was meeting along the way. And so one of the interesting collection pieces that we have in the collection in the Hugh Lane Gallery, which is part of the collection that he gave to the South, is this portrait of the notoriously sort of secretive and Alfred Cope. So Alfred Cope was a member of the team in Dublin Castle, who negotiated the peace at the end of the campaign of independence. And he sat for John Lavery in 1925. And in the Lavery collection, there's a very effusive letter from him talking about how, the Laverys were responsible for bringing about peace. And certainly in the early stages of the establishment of the Irish Free State, they continued to host the Irish delegation in their establishment of the state. But that's beyond the scope of this lecture. I really want to move on now to the sort of the collection that he produced in the main in 1928 in anticipation of a presentation to the Ulster Museum. Now, he said rather glibly that he had done it because he was from Belfast and they had a new museum and they needed to fill it with work. So, but you can never trust John Lavery. John Lavery is always inclined to sort of give you a statement, to give you a line. Nobody has done any in-depth work on this formation of this Irish collection beyond what I've done in the exhibition catalogue Passion and Politics. But one of the reasons for that is, unfortunately, we don't have John Lavery's papers. He gave papers to the Tate Museum, or indeed his secretary Kathleen Fitzgerald. Catherine Fitzgerald did. She was left the house in Cromwell Place. She was the same age as Alice, much younger woman, and the contents, including whatever paperwork remained. And so it didn't actually end up with a sizable collection. Yes, there are letters from the Laverys passing back and forth with them, with the head of the Ulster Museum at the time of the presentation. And I viewed those in the Ulster Museum many, many years ago, but they don't really give you anything of the thinking or the plan behind this collection. But what you see here is you have the 12th of July at Portadown, and he sort of gathers the impact, and you can see it in the style, this sort of there's the sort of the immediacy of the style, which is something that I actually really like. If I had a chance to get a John Lavery painting, I think I would go for one of his preparatory sketches, because I just like the immediacy of that. I suppose it's a preference thing if you perceive, like something that's more finished. But I think this is a wonderful painting. I think that it really evokes the idea. You can almost hear the sounds and the gathering of the people, and the fact that you can see the sort of the level of the people close to the parade, and then you've got people sort of lining further away against the shops. He also, met with the leaders. So between the leaders of the Orange Order, the leaders in the church, the leaders in the judiciary, the Lord Londonderry, so he picked ministers, and he met with everybody who was forming the Northern Irish state. I particularly like this painting of Archdale, and the reason I like it, I think, again, is because of the sketchy style that I've just described, where he again includes the marching behind. But I think that he's detailed here and captured the features very much of this pensive painting. It feels like a portrait. So often with Lavery, you feel that he's working on something that is a commercial piece that he is being, painting to order almost. But with these paintings that are in the Ulster Museum, and particularly this one, I feel that he really does have a sense of painting somebody as a statesman and a man of his time. Less so in this painting, and the reason I think that is because this is Sir Davison, and I think what's why I don't think about this painting is I think it's just in terms of the background and the context. But then John often did that in paintings. He didn't actually finish out a background if he felt a particular way. But I love the way that the sitter has that absolutely engagement with the viewer, but also with the artist himself. And I think something of the sadness in his face, because of course he lost his only surviving son in 1916 in the war, and someone who, his son in the newspaper reports at the time, there's a photograph of him and he's so like him. And so I think something of there's something sad, there's some of the sadness that I can see in this particular portrait. Joseph Devlin himself said this, Joe Devlin said this himself. He said it was really ugly, this painting. And then he just laughed and he said that it was very like him. He's very bold in his painting of Devlin. I mean, the first nationalist sort of speaker in the new House of Commons in Northern Ireland, and predating Stormont, but it was Stormont later on. And he paints the tricolour behind him. And again, it's this very, very quick style that Lavery does sometimes. Sometimes it looks like the artworks are by different artists. And I think the contrast between Archdale and Devlin can be seen here almost as if two styles, two different days. And my preference in this instance would be for the Archdale painting. And then you have him painting McCrory, who's the Catholic Primate of all Ireland. You can see that he very carefully includes the sort of the symbolism here. It's very much a formal portrait of a statesman, which could hang just as easily in in an archbishop's palace as it would do in an art gallery. This is the first display of the paintings in the Ulster Museum at the time, and you can see here, you can see that they're the mix between these statesmen and Lavery's own family. So you can see the Eileen and her baby. I originally had all of those paintings reproduced in this talk, but I felt that if I went into the ones the jockey and the weighing, and John Lavery himself being shown there, but I think what's important here is that, again, you see the Laverys coming over in 1929, and their arrival there, reproduced the fact that they had come to Belfast for this presentation. They didn't get the same reception when they were trying to present the paintings to the National Gallery of Ireland. They weren't interested in accepting paintings of living people, and that continued as the gallery policy for a number of years, and that's how the material ended up in the Hugh Lane collection. This self-portrait that is in Belfast, I wanted to talk about it in the context of the first painting that I showed you, where John wears just the painting coat. You can see by this stage he's become very much he wears this the neckerchief or the around his neck, usually polka dot. He has the round glasses, and you can see that he was ridiculed very much for this painting garb by the cartoonists of the day. This is sometimes dated as 1912, but I actually think that it's later, the cartoon of him by David Wilson. And behind himself, he paints the new baths, the swimming pool at Chiswick. Now, this again is John Lavery all over. He's actually very modern. So even now, as he heads into, you know, his 70s, would he be? Yeah, he'd be in his 70s at this stage. He's still very youthful, and the subjects that he picks are sort of contemporary, in a way that you probably wouldn't even take in at the time, but that had been newly opened in Chiswick, and he uses it. So again, as I said to you, artists loved him. He's very much in the press. Something of his story is really important here, and I've lectured on that separately. The idea that, you know, did he actually have a horror of the limelight, and talking more about the sort of the sort of the many faces of Lavery. But I include this here because I purchased this on eBay some time ago, and it's his collector's card. And you can see here on the back of it is very clearly stated, Sir John Lavery was born in Belfast in 1856. And that's very prominent in his bio. And at that stage, he was made a Royal Academician in 1921. So this is interesting as well, because even though he'd set up an alternative society for all the young men, he was very, very grateful to have been accepted by the establishment. And this is very important to him. He had been accepted by Antwerp, by Rome, by Belgium. He'd got awards in Italy. As I said, he'd got awards at the Paris Salon. But to be accepted by the Royal Academy in London was really important to him. And then his artistic talents have been recognised by the awards of many decorations and distinctions. He is a member of the academies. Oh, this is where it is: Antwerp, Brussels, Milan, Rome, Stockholm, and the Société Nationale du Beaux-Arts in Paris. So it's a series 72, and it's number 12. So again, you don't expect an artist to be a collector in a collector part of these were given away with cigarette packs. So again, just gives you an idea of how big he was. His wife, at the same stage in 1930, appears in a film in Buckingham Palace. She represents the Irish Free State with a harp on her head and a big large wolfhound, and she brings food from the Dominions in to make a Christmas cake at the palace. It was actually written by J.M. Barrie, and of course it caused a lot of upset within the Irish Free State. And at the same period in time, just before, they had released the John Lavery's painting had been adapted for the currency. Now, John Lavery always thought it was for his involvement in the treaty negotiations. Certainly, there was talk that they might become the viceroy and viceroy in taking over the role in Phoenix Park, which is now the home of the President Oris O'Nuthron. But basically that didn't happen. May have been because of the assassination of Kevin O'Higgins, who was promoting it. But certainly when it came to getting her painting on the currency being utilized then and changed into an engraving, was because of Thomas Bodkin, who was head of the National Gallery at the time. And we have that because the letters survived between herself and Thomas Bodkin. Their family gave them to Trinity College Dublin, and so they actually work it out between them. So it isn't anything to do the political. That was my thesis originally, was why were they John Lavery was awarded a commission for the banknotes and not open to public competition when the coinage was, which is actually won by Hungarian, the first Irish coinage for the Irish Free State. So here you can see that he paints Lady Lavery on the harp. You're very familiar with this image with the Killarney legs behind. But this is a scrapbook that's in the Hugh Lane collection, where he actually notes that he had reworked his painting of Mrs. Lavery of 1909 as the lady on the harp. So he took the composition and reworked it and didn't make a new canvas at all. So that's an indication again of this idea that he wasn't as keen for the commission as maybe he would have done. And then when it was engraved, the image of the monarch was removed and she became the head on the currency, which is what gave it more prominence, and that's why they became known as the Lavery notes. And it was only when you got to the 20 denomination did you have the full image, and that was the 20, the 50 and the 100. But most ordinary people would not have seen more than the 10 shilling note and the pound note. And certainly when 20 would have maybe been at a mart or somebody exchanging something of that nature, but certainly most people would have carried around the 10 shilling or the pound. So I wanted to conclude my presentation tonight, and I hope that I've given you a real sense of the Laverys and something about the context of the Irish collection, and in particular the Ulster Museum's collection. And that is to include this portrait, which again is one of my favourites. And I was once at a dinner in Ulster in Queen's in University in Belfast. And I was very surprised to see him looking down at me from the wall. And of course, he painted this portrait because he had been given the freedom of Belfast. He was the first Catholic to have been awarded the freedom of Dublin and the freedom of Belfast. And if you see the list of the freedoms that have been given, in particular, that I've seen the list for Dublin, it isn't a long list. And he was so well recognised as an Irishman and claimed by most people. And I think that he is and would be proud to be included in the lecture series that is The Birth of Northern Ireland. Thank you very much indeed.